showing, and I thank you all for coming. Um, our program is Slavery in Mamaroneck Township. Ned Benton and I are presenting. The library is hosting it. Realm, Remembering Enslaved African Americans, Larchmont and Mamaroneck are sponsoring it, and Mamaroneck and Larchmont Historical Societies are sponsoring it. Now, tonight, what we are intending to do, this is part 2 of our program. We're going to be focusing on children born to enslaved mothers, Ginny and Banjo Billy, and the story of John Cox and Andrew Cole. And I'll turn it over to Ned to start his program. Ned, you there?
Ned, unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, we're starting with some very, I would say, intimate records. If we want to meet the people who were enslaved, some very intimate records that are in the town of Mamaroneck, a town clerk's office, in the town hall, these are based on. Now I'm trying to get it to go. These are based on the Gradual Abolition Act from 1799, and this was a way to end slavery in New York that was a compromise between the abolitionists and the enslavers. The abolitionists wanted to end slavery. The enslavers wanted to keep continuing it. And so the arrangement was that we would end slavery, but at a future point. And in fact, if you were enslaved in 1799, when this law was passed, this was like an exceptional condition in healthcare. You were not eligible. You only your children were eligible. So, if a child was born to an enslaved mother, let me go back here. Then the enslaver had to go to the town and identify that the mother had a child, and then register that child for service for 28 years if the child was a boy, and for 25 years if the child was a girl. And the goal of this act was that after 28 years or some period of time, slavery would end, but the owners would vote for it because 2/3 of the senators in New York State were enslavers. And so they had to come up with something that would work for them. Someone's microphone's on. Anyway, there was also the option that the owner could abandon the baby and treat the baby as a pauper, as a child of a pauper. And because this allowed the owners to not be responsible for babies that they could never sell. Now, as this bill went along, the legislature started out paying $3.50 a month for the abandoned baby children to be taken care of by someone else. But they lowered the payment to $2 a month, and then repealed the abandonment compensation program, not the law itself, but the payment of the foster parents. In 1804, after the costs rose to be 6.1% of the entire state budget, that was expected to grow if they did nothing, because they weren't going to lose enslaved people. They were going to get more and more. But they said that enslavers could abandon the children as children of paupers, but the towns and cities had to continue to bear the cost. It sounds like a New York tradition. And in 1870, the number of years of service was equalized to 21 years for children, male or female. And then while permanent slaves, that is to say, the people who were slaves in 1799 and were not ever supposed to be freed, they were freed in 1827. A child born to an enslaved mother before July 1827 could still be registered for service for 21 more years. That is to say, 1848. So we sometimes say that slavery ended in New York in 1827, but for some people it didn't end until 1848. Now, these are the registrations of children that are in the town clerk's office, in the Mamaroneck, town of Mamaroneck town clerk's office, and she'll show them to you. They've digitized them, they're there. But let's look at some individual ones, because what you're seeing are records that identify the enslaver. The enslaver is identifying the mother that he or she is enslaving and the baby that's born, and then holding them for future service. Now, in this one, we have John Peter Delancey, and Phoebe was bought for $60 from H.G. Livington of New York City in 1798. Now, in 1800, Phoebe's son Henry is born, and John Peter Delancey registers him for 28 years of service. That would then go to 1828, which would be beyond the end of slavery we think of in New York. Here's John Peter Delancey again. This is a child, and Peter, the father that he identifies, he was purchased for $180 from Valentine Nutter of New York City, and they registered the daughter. Now, this is a unique one. This is the only one we have where the enslaver didn't register the child for service, but instead abandoned the child. In this case, Rogers, who was a doctor who also turned out to be was later elected as the town clerk, he didn't even name, he said, born of a Negro woman slave, my property, but didn't even name the mother. But immediately just abandoned this child and separated the child, presumably, from the mother. We don't know literally what happened, but it's a very different and concerning record. Now, here we have John P. Delancey, and he purchased a slave named Tom in 1795, and so this was 1805. This is a later record. Then Eliza, here, this is to certify that my Negro woman, Bet, had a female child born on the 2nd day of March, 1809, which child is called Eliza. And the father of said child is Jack Purdy. And this is Gilbert Budd, the former town clerk, and now David Rogers, the abandoner, is the town clerk. In 1803, Jack Purdy was purchased for 5 years from a person in Rye. And in 1809, John Peter Delancey says, I just thought you might like to know that Jack Purdy, former time servant, fathered a daughter Eliza with Gilbert Budd's slave Bet. This was in a different document. And then here, the last one, here we're seeing the manor house, the Larchmont Manor House in the middle of the manor at the top of Prospect Avenue. And here Charlotte, a child of Nellie, a servant of Peter J. Monroe, was born on the 25th of May, 1814. And so this child was born in the manor house, which is the building that we now know and cherish in Larchmont Manor. I mean, it's an absolute record that this building housed an enslaved person and the enslaved person's child. Now I'm going to turn it over to John.
And where we're going now is to individuals that were enslaved in Mamaroneck that we have some stories and details about. I'm going to start by talking about Ginny and Billy. Now, the Mott family, who owned the Premium Point Mill, also known as the Red Mill to some circles. In 1689, James Mott sells Jack to Humphrey Underhill of Rye, New York. And the Underhills ended up in Mamaroneck as well, that family. In the 1810 census, the Motts were the owners of 3 enslaved persons, which is kind of weird. And I'll tell you why in a second. James Mott was a Quaker, all right? And he and the rest of the Quakers were against enslaving people. In 1791, they had a meeting and basically said, if you've got slaves, you've got to free them. However, James Mott made his opposition to slavery clear in 1811. The Township record states, I have purchased a Joshua Purdy, a Negro man named Andrew, who is about 26 years of age and has a promise of a person I bought him of that he should be free at 28 years of age. Now, what's strange about this is that he had freed Ginny and Billy during the Revolutionary War. Now, this picture, this painting, is really the only known enslaved people in Mamaroneck, images of them, all right? We have guesses on a whole bunch of others, but these are real people, and these are real images of real people that actually Robert Mott, one of the Motts, drew in about 1814. Now, the stories that I'm about to share with you all are sourced from this book. And what this is Adam and Ann Mott, their ancestors and descendants. It was published in the 1890s. And what it is a remembrance of the family. And the early records share with a lot of information about Ginny and Billy. This is Adam and Ann, who the book is about. I think this was about 1860, 1870, something like that. Now, Abigail, who is a wife of Ann Mott's elder brother, has a number of specific references to Billy and Ginny. I'll go through them, but I'm not going to read this because the subsequent slides will detail what's going on. Billy was born about 1738. His parents, Tom and Carrie, being slaves of Thomas Bown of Long Island. For a while, he was assigned to a neighbor. He wasn't sold, he was just lent. He married Ginny around 1760. In 1769, he was traded for another enslaved person so that Ginny and Billy would not be separated, having been married when Ginny was 20. They began to live at the mill house once they moved back to Mamaroneck, and he died in 1826. Let's pause for a moment while we listen to Banjo Billy on a warm summer evening overlooking the Premium Point Tidal Pond at the mill house, playing an old tune for Ginny on his African-style dry-gourd banjo, evoking for her images when she was a young child far, far away in Africa. Banjo Billy, he made dry gourd banjos and played them, and therefore had the nickname Banjo Billy. It's not a fanciful instrument of today. It was a genuine banjo of Africa. He not only played it, but he made them, having large dried gourd for the sounding board, hence his sobriquet of Billy Banjo. Ginny was landed from a slave ship which brought her from Africa around 1744. In the New York slave market, she was bought by Samuel Underhill, the grandfather of Ann Mott, who wanted the little slave girl to wait on his wife, Ann Carpenter Underhill, and their children. She married Billy around 1760.
1760.
Yeah, 1760. In 1769, Ginny and Billy began to live at the mill house. She was the mother of 9 sons and 1 daughter. She died in 1818. It was likely that Ginny was transported from Africa in the slave ship David. According to the New York Weekly Journal, the ship left New York in January 1744, and the investors bought 181 people in Africa. They returned to New York in 1744 in July. That was the only direct shipment from Africa of enslaved people between 1743 and 1745. Of the 181 enslaved people who started the voyage, 26 died and 155 survived. According to David Bryan Davis in Inhuman Bondage, after the fire conspiracies in New York in 1712, and particularly 1741, enslaved people imported directly from Africa were preferred by Americans because enslaved people imported from the Caribbean were considered more dangerous. The slave masters in the Caribbean were very, very strict, mean, and brutal. Ginny was old enough to remember the life in Africa was grand. There was no ice and no snow and summer all the time, without care or clothes. Ginny said she was put upon the slave boat, still clothesless, until she was offered for sale in New York. As caretaker for the Mott family, she liked to tell stories of her life in Africa. She led them to believe she was a daughter of a king or a chief or someone of consequence of some kind. This is a quote from one of the Mott families. Here on the fishing ground or sitting in Uncle Billy's lap by the kitchen fire, we listened with attention that never flagged. Under more than twice told stories, while he droned stories of unwritten history of the war times that he had come within his observation. And one of the interesting things about Billy's storytelling is that as a good wife, Ginny was there all the time to correct him and take over telling the stories at times. This is a story of something that happened during the Revolutionary War. There was a group of whaleboatmen during the war that worked the Sound. Cap Pete, which is Captain Peter Davis, led those group of people. Well, Cap Pete's daughter and wife wanted to go to New York to buy dresses for her upcoming wedding, a wedding with one of Captain Pete's mates. But New York was controlled by the enemy at that point. So before they went, Billy and Ginny picked a corn basket full of wild blackberries to sell in the city and to buy ammunition for duck hunting. Quote from Billy: "If I didn't shoot no ducks, I might have to do some other shooting, and so it is well to be ready anyway." The expeditions to the city were done frequently, but they were always done in darkness, often when it was stormy. The route was always down the rocky coastline of Nurse Shell, Davenport Neck, Pelham to Throggs Neck, where the boats were portaged or carried across the neck and returned to the water, where an easy row of 12 miles down the East River with ebb tide would bring them to Wallabout, the current site of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. They reached the ferry at Brooklyn, going on to Manhattan. Billy sold his blueberries and was able to buy things that Ginny needed, as well as the shot he needed for duck hunting. At the appointed time that night, they met at a spot at a small creek where they had sunk their boats to hide it from the British. They raised it and waited as 3 of their party was missing. One finally came back drunk, all right? So they knew what the other 2 were doing, and they decided not to wait anymore. Finally, Cap Pete decided to leave as the tide was in their favor and the morning light was coming. Before they were in the water, an alarm sounded on the frigates, the British frigates, all right, out in the Sound. The 2 women, all right, the wife of Captain Billy and his daughter, took over the steering oars, all right? Now, these whaleboats were oared boats. There was no sails and there was no rudder. They were good sailors and could steer, and all the men, including Billy, rowed for all they were worth. They rowed towards Pelham Bay, which is a rocky and dangerous coast. Cap Pete knew the coastline, every rock, reef, and shoal. He guided them close to shore, attempting to get them out of the range of the boats, continually firing at them. The firing had awakened a group of their old antagonists, the refugees, which were basically British Tory soldiers that were sheltered in a barn on Pelham Bay. They kept rowing, all right? They kept rowing and rowing and rowing. Once they got behind City Island, they were safe from the Briggs fire, but now we're getting volleys from the mainland refugees. Shots went high, hitting no one, but keeping their attention in their efforts of hightailing it out of danger. They passed City Island and began dodging obstacles ahead. These people, the sailors, the men, were rowing like crazy. As Billy used to say, everybody was thinking too hard to talk. The brig had fired her bow gun only, but in the heavy sea was pitching and rolling, so the aim was very poor. In fact, not a shot had come dangerously near them, but they were getting closer by the moment. They were fully exposed as they crossed the mouth of Echo Bay. Close to shore, they considered stopping, but then they alerted that a group of armed refugees lurked there, so onward they pulled. Now comes the tug, boys, lay to and pull, Uncle Billy cried. The household at the mill had been alerted by the firing of the brig as it rounded Whortleberry Island, which is now known as Huckleberry Island. The shots were getting closer as they neared the safety of the cove. Jenny screamed, "Oh, here they come, close by. Pull, Bill, pull." Suddenly, the brig rounded to and sent a broadside. At that moment, it rolled slightly and sent the balls way too high. At that moment, it yawed and brought the starboard guns to bear and sent a second broadside. The front boat was behind the first set of rocks at the pond. The ball struck the rock and bounded high above, sending stony fragments over the participants. In a few seconds, they were safe behind the cove and out of danger. The next morning, after a hearty breakfast and a day of recovery, the Motts had put up 20 guests for the night before. 4 of Billy and Ginny's sons stood guard, including an 8 and 10-year-old, put on duty to let them be involved. They spotted a group of Tories sneaking up through the salt meadows. Refugees, refugees, cowboys, cowboys. Cowboys was another name for the refugees, by the way. Jake, who was near their house, ran to the barn and aroused the whaleboatmen, who rushed out arms in hand time to see the refugees fleeing over the marsh. It turned out they were the same group, reinforced, that had spotted them at Echo Bay the previous day. If it wasn't for Billy's boys, they might have concluded their intentions on the whaleboat. I'm going to switch to the next slide because these are out of order. No, you've got one left. All right, I'll just talk it. A local refugee by the name of Fade Merritt, one of the wealthy landowners in Mamaroneck that owned slaves, attacked the Mott farm, correctly suspecting that the whaleboatmen were back, and had attacked a couple of British sloops and made off with cattle and goods. They were using a Premium Point mill area to hide their boats and goods. Billy and his son Jess were in charge of the boats on the Mill Creek. Fade captured Billy, but Jess was able to run away and alert the men in the barn, who reacted by hiding behind a stone wall, running back and forth, kicking up a large amount of dust, and making it appear as if there were many more men than they actually were. What this caused was Fade and his group to run away. They thought they were being attacked by a large group of men. A short time later, all right, Billy was out in the Sound fishing, having been alerted that Merritt was coming. Fade stood on the rocks, and he was somebody that attacked the Mott farm and a lot of farms in the area relentlessly, all right, taking their goods. Anyway, Fade stood on the rocks trying to get Billy's attention. Billy was out fishing out in the Sound, shouting and waving, trying to get him to come in. Billy ignored him. He later said that he had heard him, but did not give any indication of it, faking deafness. Ginny's comment to Fade was that her man's concentrated when he was working. We need them fish to eat. Ned?
Yeah, thank you, John. Well, now we're going to describe two other enslaved people from Mamaroneck, John Cox and Andrew Cole. And the background here is that during the Revolutionary War, both sides attempted at various points to recruit enslaved people to their side. So the Earl of Dunmore, the British governor, said, "I declare that all indented servants, Negroes, and others free that are able to bear arms, joining His Majesty's troops as soon as they may be, for the more speedily reducing the colony to a proper sense of their duty." He said basically that they would be freed if the British won, and even if the British lost. Now, Mamaroneck's enslaved people included John Cox and Andrew Cole. John Cox was born in about 1752 and was owned by Eliezer Godden. The name does not appear in any other records, but census records with names were rare. The name may have been Eliezer Jedney, after whom the Jedney Cemetery is named. Eliezer Jedney had many enslaved people. Andrew Cole was born about 1757 and was owned by Ben Cole. Ben Cole may have been a relative of James Cole, the Mamaroneck cobbler. We saw his name last week on one of the maps. Joseph and John Coles also appear in the 1790 census for Mamaroneck. Both of them left their enslavers in Mamaroneck and joined up with the British forces. Now, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris ended the Revolutionary War, and enslaved people who served under the British would be permitted to emigrate, and the British would compensate their owners. And there are two versions of this list. They're identical in terms of the names, but there are two versions of it. This is one from Canada. It's called the Book of Negro, and it records the names of the enslaved people and the enslavers. For example, you have Henry Washington, the slave of General Washington. That's President George Washington. You also have Massey, enslaved by John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States and the namesake of my college. So we first find them in the Book of Negroes record. They were in July 1783 aboard the Clinton, which is a ship bound for Annapolis and St. John under Lieutenant Trounce. They report John Cox, a sturdy fellow, formerly the property of Eliezer Godden of Mamaroneck, which is Mamaroneck, New York, left him 7 years ago. Also, Nellie Cox and her 2 children. He has a wife and 2 children since he left Mamaroneck. Andrew Coles, 26, a stout fellow, formerly the property of Ben Cole, Mamaroneck, New York, left him 4 years ago, and also Mary Coles, his wife. So he has married also while serving in the British military. John Cox and Andrew Cole didn't disembark in Annapolis, which was what the ship register said. They went on to St. John. Andrew Cole is identified on the list of Black Loyalists arriving at St. John. His name appears as Andrew Cole, and he is listed as having a wife. In 1783, St. John's meant the mouth of the St. John's River, which is now New Brunswick. what was then the northwestern part of the colony of Nova Scotia. Within 2 years, the tiny settlement at the mouth of the St. John River became the city of St. John. Did Cox and Cole have families? There are good reasons to believe they did. The census of St. John in 1783 and 1784 shows Andrew Cole as being married as of 1784, and Jacob Cox as having a child under 10. The complete ship manifest for the Clinton shows passengers on the Clinton, including Mary Coles and Nellie Cox. Mary Coles, Andrew Cole's wife, was freeborn from Mosquito Cove in Long Island, the place which is now known as Glen Cove. Nellie Cox was listed as the former property of Paul Burtis in Long Island. Cox and Cole may have met these women during the war, or they could have met immediately before and during the trip from New York to New Brunswick. Now, in 1787, a petition for land is presented by another freed slave, Richard Carancapone Wheeler, who signed for Jacob Cox and Andrew Cole and others. And so this is a petition for land in Nova Scotia. Now, is Jacob Cox John Cox? There's good reasons to believe they are. Jacob Cox is a signer along with Andrew Cole of 2 Carancapone petitions. How likely is it that John Cox appears and Jacob Cox simultaneously materializes as Andrew Cole's partner in 2 positions representing that they're freed slaves? The freed slaves on Carancapone's petition were people who joined with him on the Clinton. There is no Jacob Cox on the Clinton, and there is no evidence that Jacob is a different person than John. There is no Jacob Cox in the Book of Negroes, which identified all the former slaves freed by the British. Cox and Cole's names appear adjacent to each other in the Book of Negroes and in the petition. In the census of St. John in 1783 and 1784, there is a Jacob Cox, but not a John Cox. Once again, there is no evidence of a different John Cox in the area. There's no evidence that Cox or Cole disembarked in Annapolis. Cox and Cole were part of a community of Black Loyalists that began to form as the refugees sailed for British North America. The men were from many colonies, but they acted together, placing themselves under the leadership of Richard Wheeler, Richard Carancapone Wheeler, another Clinton passenger. Carancapone, the former Richard Wheeler, was a healthy 30-year-old bachelor who had bought his freedom in 1776 from Jacob Wheeler, his master in New Jersey, although over 210 Black Loyalists sailed with Carancapone. 15 of them were to become close friends in the new colony of New Brunswick and would look to him as their leader. They had once been enslaved in Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, and South Carolina, as well as New Jersey. In 1783, however, they thought they were about to embrace the life of free men as they settled alongside white loyalists at the mouth of the St. John River. This is by a historian in Nova Scotia, Stephen Crane Davidson. There is a land grant in 1787 that names Jacob Cox and Andrew Cole. And so you can see their names are in here. And they're granted title to land in Nova Scotia. Professor Davidson said he couldn't find any other Coxes in this period of New Brunswick history other than Jacob Cox. It seems to have been a rare name. There is a Jeremy Cox who married in a community along the St. John River in 1806. If this were Jacob Cox's child under 10 in 1783, he would certainly be of marriageable age by 1806. That's what we know today. So we have no further record of coal in St. John. Richard Carancapone Wheeler, upon learning about the opportunity to leave Nova Scotia for Sierra Leone, joined with 4 friends, walked 400 miles to Halifax to accept the offer of resettlement in Africa. Was Andrew Cole one of the 4 friends? Perhaps. As the records of life in Freetown are reconstructed and digitized, the name of Andrew Cole may once again emerge. Now, this is the place that they got their land grant. It's a place which has been called Negro Lake in Westfield, New Brunswick. And you can see there's a lot of narrative about this. I won't read about it, but basically this was the area that they settled. And, you know, I always had thought that maybe Cox and Cole would be on the shore of Nova Scotia, because if they grew up in Mamaroneck, they would know about fishing and shipping, but they were put up here in this barren, very difficult area. Recently, in 2017, New Brunswick officially replaced 5 place names in the St. John area that used the anachronistic word Negro. The province announced that Negro Lake in Great Bay, Westfield would be called Carancapone Lake in honor of Richard Wheeler, whose African name was Carancapone. The New Jersey Black History Society's Ralph Thomas says this man brought other members of the Black community in Westfield to Sierra Leone in search of a better life. Today, you can go to the Black Loyalist Heritage Society Historical Site and Museum in Birchtown, Nova Scotia. On the wall, on the glass wall, I mean, there's a great deal of material in the museum about the lives of Black people who went from the United States to Canada. But on the wall, all of their names are engraved, including John Cox and Andrew Cole from Mamaroneck. They are commemorated in Birchtown, Nova Scotia, as people from Mamaroneck. Today, Realm, which is recognizing enslaved Africans from Larchmont and Mamaroneck, seeks through research, education, civic engagement, to honor the history, humanity, and contribution of enslaved men, women, and children who helped to build our community. The goals are to recognize the enslaved individuals, as we've done last week and this week, engage the community in creating a memorial to recognize the enslaved people, develop and implement plans for educational programs in conjunction with the memorial, and raise funds for the creation and installation of a permanent memorial. Now I'm going to stop the share. And we're ready for questions or comments.